Good morning and good afternoon to our friends in Europe. My name is Natalia Bănulescu-Bogdan, and I am the Associate Director of MPI's International Program. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our call today, Making the Global Compact on Migration a Reality, Ideas for Enhancing Regular Migration Pathways at All Skill Levels. First, just a couple housekeeping notes. Audio from our call will be on our website later today. You can access that at migrationpolicy.org/events. For any technical issues, you can email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1929. If you have any problems hearing via the web, you can dial in using the call-in information sent earlier via email. And if you hear any loud hammering, it's not you, it's us. We are experiencing a bit of construction, though I hope it won't impede our call today. At the end of the call, we're going to have a written question and answer session. You can participate by typing any questions you have into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen, or you can email events@migrationpolicy.org. Or you can tweet your questions to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. The last announcement is I want to point you to some relevant materials on our website. The discussion today draws on research that we've conducted for our project Toward a Global Compact for Migration, Rethinking the Links Between Migration and Development, which is a collaboration between MPI and GIZ, Germany's Development Cooperation Agency, and is supported by BMZ, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We have produced a series of papers for this project with contributions from all of the experts on the call today, so please check those out. And we have a brand new paper that was released just this morning by Kate Hooper, whom you'll hear from in a moment, which is called Reimagining Skilled Migration Partnerships to Support Development. So let's dive right in. As we get closer to the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration, one of the lingering questions about implementation is how states can build productive relationships with countries with vastly different interests. And one of the key issues is, of course, the movement of workers at all skill levels. This issue has climbed to the top of the political agenda, particularly in Europe, where policymakers are eager to put in place alternatives to the irregular flows that plunged the continent in crisis beginning in 2014. We have a wonderful set of 3 panelists today who will address a few of the specific challenges involved in expanding legal migration pathways, including routes for low-skilled workers, and what we can expect from the new global skills partnership model emphasized in the Compact. This idea involves collaborating on training skilled workers much earlier in the migration process so they can fill labor market gaps in countries of destination if they decide to move, or fill gaps at home if they decide to stay or return. Many of these schemes, of course, hold great potential on paper, but can struggle to get beyond the pilot stage in practice. So our experts are going to walk us through some of the pitfalls to avoid in designing and targeting these programs. So to start us off, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kathleen Newland. She's a senior fellow at MPI and has been leading MPI's work on migration and development since before even the field existed. So she's going to start us off with the big picture on how legal migration pathways have been incorporated into the Global Compact and what we can expect.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and welcome to my other 2 colleagues. In particular, congratulations to Kate Hooper on the publication of her paper today. And thanks again to Andrea for a great partnership on working on our paper on legal pathways for low-skilled migrants. The Global Compact on Migration takes on both of these issues, and particularly in its objective number 5, it talks about enhancing the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration. It's interesting to note that in earlier versions of the Global Compact text, the objective was framed as facilitating enhancing the availability and flexibility of pathways for regular migration at all skill levels. And the phrasing at all skill levels dropped out of the final text in the overall description of the objective, although it turns up in some of the 10 or so specific actions that are recommended as ways to fulfill this objective of enhancing legal pathways. Nonetheless, the objective on enhancing legal pathways illustrates the Global Compact's ability to address the concerns of all the participating nations, that is, the countries of origin, which are very interested in having greater access to labor markets of more developed countries, as well as the interests of countries of destination, which are very interested in sort of regaining control of the migration process, making sure that it does proceed through lawful channels. That's the overall purpose of the compact, to ensure safe, orderly, and legal migration. And I think that all of the countries recognize that there's a symmetry between an increased emphasis on rule of law in migration, that is, the observance and enforcement of national migration laws and policies, but recognize that that needs to be balanced out by greater labor market access, particularly in the light of the fact that many countries of destination, indeed most of the highly developed countries, are facing both demographic challenges in that the working age population is already or will soon begin to decline in numbers, and also many of them are experiencing good economic conditions which have resulted in fairly low unemployment rates. So in particular sectors, which I think is something that Andrea will talk about in greater detail, there is a real demand for immigrant labor, but at the same time, a popular reaction in many countries to immigration, which much of the public seems to perceive as being out of control and, generally speaking, too high. So balancing this, balancing what might be perceived as the tensions between national sovereignty and the enforcement of national immigration laws versus greater opening of legal pathways is something that the Global Compact on safe, orderly, and regular migration does, I think, fairly successfully square that circle. The legal pathways that are envisioned are envisioned mainly in terms of bilateral, regional, and multilateral labor mobility agreements that are in conformity with human rights law, with gender guidelines, with anti-smuggling and trafficking agreements, and so on. But they are very much intended to put the states, both individually and cooperatively, back in charge of the migration that continues to be a very large phenomenon in not only from developing to the developed world, but within regions, and that's part of the emphasis also of Objective 5 is to promote regional agreements that will integrate further the labor markets in regions through agreements like ECOWAS and Mercosur, the integration agreements in West Africa and in South America. So these are some of the solutions that are mentioned and that are reached for in the Global Compact for Migration. Probably the most controversial recommendation under Objective 5 is facilitating access to procedures for family reunification for migrants. And there, the phrase "at all skill levels" does reappear. And this, of course, is something that many countries of destination would like to limit, because many of them would prefer to see legal pathways for low-skilled migrants taking place mainly on a temporary basis. And with that introduction, I think I would like to hand over to Andrea Riester to talk in more detail about our joint paper on legal pathways for low-skilled, or as we would prefer to say, low-waged migrants, because we recognize that many people who are described as low-skilled actually have a rich endowment of acquired skills. And so it's probably better to describe them as low-waged migrants.
Thank you, Kathleen. Go ahead, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen and Natalia, and thanks for inviting me to speak here today. What I'm going to present is really the result of an analytical exercise that Kathleen and I did together. And we tried to map existing legal migration pathways for low-skilled workers. And I'm going to summarize this by using the broad categories of why, what, and how. And at the end, I'll just go briefly into the recommendations we see for development cooperation. So why does low-skilled labor migration happen, and why is it being fostered from the political side? Well, basically, you would think, of course, that labor market policy is responsible for most legal pathways for low-skilled migrants, with the idea, of course, of closing gaps in the labor market. However, this is rarely the case, as Kathleen pointed out already. Most labor migration policies are targeting high-skilled or skilled migrants. Low-skilled labor usually comes in via other channels, family reunification, for example, but this, in a way, is a very inefficient way of finding the workforce you need, and it can also lead to brain waste because people are forced to work below their qualifications very often. And what we also see as a result is a lot of irregular migration in the low-wage sectors, and that's usually an indicator for a lack of workforce in the destination country. Instead, what's going on is that migration management is at the core of some of the legal pathways for low-skilled migrants. The idea is to open legal pathways in order to reduce irregular migration and the vulnerabilities that come with it. But the long-term reduction of irregular migration is very complex and needs to work at both ends of the migration corridor. So on the one hand, reducing demand in destination countries, as well as reducing the push factors in the origin countries, and also closing the income gap between the two countries. And therefore, if expanding legal pathways is seen as a means to manage migration, it's very likely to produce disappointments. Some legal pathways are a humanitarian response to international crisis and are usually directed towards refugees in the form of resettlement. Again, this might lead to brain waste if the labor market is not fully open for these persons. And in recent years, we've seen more debate about legal pathways for low-skilled migrants as an instrument for development. And this is mainly due to the impact on poverty reduction that this type of migration can have, in particular if the wage gap is very large. So what is low-skilled migration, regular low-skilled migration? It has, of course, the question of a sectoral dimension. Usually it's in sectors where the work cannot easily be outsourced or automated even, which is, of course, child and elder care, domestic services, construction, hospitality, agricultural labor, or at least parts of it, food preparation and service, construction and landscaping. And what's important to us, or what we see, is that all these sectors are, of course, deeply gendered. And women tend to work in those sectors that are the least protected, like domestic care, domestic services and care services in individual households. So there's a very particular vulnerability to that aspect. The temporal dimension has already been mentioned. There are permanent programs, but they are very limited. Most of the low-skilled migration programs are temporary, and it's, of course, logic to offer temporary jobs for temporary work, but if there are long-term shortages, for example, in the care sector, then a high turnover can also be quite problematic. And, of course, not talking about we should talk about the problems involved for the migrants who don't have a permanent perspective. And then there's also a geopolitical dimension to low-skilled labor migration programs. On the one hand, it's easy to understand that the physical proximity makes it particularly easy for temporary migration to take place. It's easy to migrate, and it's easy to return. And in many instances, we see historic and colonial and linguistic ties at play, but we also see that pre-existing networks facilitate migration, of course. And sometimes there are programs, indeed, that are initiated due to very particular policy interests. One example we found was the not very obvious labor migration scheme between Mauritius and Canada, for example, which had no prior ties or linkages, but where it was decided specifically to initiate that type of program. And how is regular low-skilled migration taking place? Well, one very easy way where this can happen are free movement areas, like within the EU or within ECOWAS. And this is great, of course, for the migrants because it offers legal protection and it allows migrants to decide freely where they want to go and for how long they want to go there. Then we see trade agreements like NAFTA and GATS who cover the provision of services in other countries, but this is very rarely used particularly for low-skilled migration. Again, rather targeting high-skilled or skilled migration. Then bilateral agreements are mostly the most common form to foster low-skilled migration, in particularly between developing and developed countries. So in the framework of the GCM, there was this call for setting up new legal pathways for low-skilled workers as a development instrument, but this, of course, would have to be designed in a very sensitive and do-no-harm way. And from our point of view, that means it's very useful to build on existing partnerships. And the focus of development-oriented labor migration schemes should be on regulating recruitment and protecting migrant workers against abuse. And these programs should be very clear in their design of target groups and timeframes, and still offer a maximum of flexibility when it comes to change of employer, length of stay, options for renewal, or the big question of integration and citizenship in the long term. It's clear that these kind of programs require a lot of communication and coordination between countries, but also between the different ministries in the respective countries involved. And for the sake of lessons learned, and because we are also in the area of research and replication of programs, it would be very useful to build in regular evaluation in upcoming migration schemes, which are likely to happen now under the GCM.
Andrea, thank you so much for that overview and the helpful distillation of the tricky balancing act that must be achieved in this area. Before we turn to Kate Hooper, could we just ask you for a quick follow-up? And if you could tell us what Germany's experience has been in this area, since we know you are leaders in this field. If you could just offer an example for our audience today. Well,
we have seen the implementation of a program in the health sector, which is called Triple Win. It's implemented by GIZ, and it's actually financed by the employers who are looking for nurses in Germany. There's a big shortage of nurses in Germany as well. And so this program has been ongoing since oh, don't tie me down, 2014, 2013 maybe, and more than 2,000 nurses so far have been recruited. There is pre-departure training, language training, and a big part of the program is also helping the nurses in finding their way around the German the market for getting your qualifications recognized, which is quite complicated because it's different in the different parts of Germany and requires a lot of administration. And the countries where these nurses are being recruited are countries which experience also a high level of unemployment of nurses. So we explicitly did not want to foster a brain drain in the care sector or care drain, but we were looking for countries who have also a mutual interest in having legal migration pathways for their nurses. But then again, this is in the skilled sector. This is not a program directed toward low-skilled workers or low-skilled migrants.
Thank you. This is a great segue, actually, to what Kate is going to be talking about next, particularly as you describe these efforts to recruit workers from shortage sectors in Germany, where there might be actually an oversupply in countries of origin. Kate's going to present another model which looks at boosting supply where there is need in both countries of origin and destination. So we're going to turn over to her right now. Kate Hooper is an associate policy analyst at MPI who works closely with me and Kathleen Newland in the International Program and is an expert on all things labor migration. And she's going to walk us through the intricacies of designing skills partnerships. Kate.
Thanks, Natalia. So Andrea's example is a really helpful segue into these partnerships. So there have really been a long history of bilateral partnerships between destination and origin countries to try and encourage labor migration in high-demand sectors. And over the years, these have typically targeted low-skilled work, and relatively fewer have focused on middle or high-skilled work. The example that Andrea gives is one exception to that rule. But we've seen this rising demand in destination countries for skilled workers in growing sectors like nursing, which really offers this opportunity for further collaboration between destination and origin countries on sort of sustainable recruitment and migration ship partnerships. So I thought I'd just take us through how these sort of traditional partnerships work before delving into the particulars of skills partnerships, which is this newer model that's been set out in the Global Compact. So these partnerships generally try to recruit people for training or work placements in destination countries, usually on a temporary basis. Typically, these have targeted qualified professionals, so for example, a registered nurse or a recent graduate without very much work experience. And the training that people receive varies from program to program, but you usually receive some language instruction and tailored vocational training with the idea of bridging any gaps in your knowledge or abilities to help prepare people for their placement. And the idea here is that destination countries can get the workers they need, migrants get valuable training and experience, and then countries of origin benefit both from the remittances they receive and skills transfer. So this idea that migrants return home and then they put their new skills to use. And so these partnerships have been up and running for many years now, but we've really seen a sort of mixed set of results. So some programs have run very successfully for years, but other programs haven't really made it past the pilot stage, or they aren't even fully implemented to begin with. The quality of evaluations really varies, but some of the reasons that our research has been able to glean include factors like there's limited employer buy-in, sometimes there's disappointing on-the-job performance, the political climate can change. So, for example, if a recession hits, labor migration often becomes less of a priority, and also high operational costs are a big issue. Middle or high-skilled migrants might need months of intensive language and vocational training to work in their profession, and this can end up costing quite a lot, so it can be quite difficult to sustain. And another issue with these traditional partnerships is that the development benefits can be a little bit mixed. So some programs have a very clear skills development component. You know, they offer work experience and on-the-job training to recent graduates, or they train someone to work in a new specialty. So, for example, you could train a nurse to work in a nursing home, so you specialize in geriatric care. But for some of these other programs, the development benefits in practice can be a little bit less clear. You know, some programs might employ participants in a more junior role, which can be really helpful when people are, you know, bridging gaps in their training or experience. But if there isn't a real clear pathway for people to resume their full responsibilities, arguably you're kind of de-skilling people rather than developing their skills further. And then other programs, you know, really focus on giving people host country language skills, which is obviously really important for doing your job, but it might not be that useful for migrants when they go home, especially when we're talking about a less commonly used language like, say, Finnish. So apart from receiving remittances, the main benefit for countries of origin is really when migrants return home and put their skills to use. But not all migrants do end up returning home, so they might get sponsored for a longer-term visa by their employer, or they might migrate somewhere else. And then you also run the risk of those who do return home not being able to find a job that uses their new skill set. So again, you have this situation where you might end up with some skills waste or repeat migration. But sort of against that background where there have been some very promising traditional partnerships and in some where the migration and development benefits are a bit more mixed, that the Global Compact set out this other approach called a Global Skills Partnership. So as Natalia sort of set out earlier, this idea really invests earlier in the migration cycle and it takes a bit more of a systemic approach. So the idea here is that you're investing in the education and training that migrants and their peers receive in the country of origin before they're fully qualified. So instead of targeting recent graduates and qualified professionals, this approach targets students and it includes both migrants and non-migrants. And the logic here is that training people in countries of origin tends to be much cheaper. So the idea being that you can train one person in a destination country, but for the same price, you could probably afford to train several people. So Michael Clemens at the Center for Global Development, who's really helped to develop this idea of a skills partnership, ran some estimates, and he found that a 3-year professional nursing program in Germany can cost between $80,000 to $100,000, but the equivalent cost less than $14,000 in Tunisia or Morocco. So that's an idea of the sort of cost differential. And the skills partnership approach really takes a different approach to the development benefits component. So for traditional partnerships, most hinge on the decisions of the individual migrant. So if they return home, if they find a job in that field. But for skills partnerships, the main benefit is the subsidized training for non-migrants. So essentially, you're creating new skilled workers for little or no cost to the country of origin instead of just recruiting labor. So there's some key distinctions here between the two models. But in practice, the skills partnership approach is a very promising model, but it remains largely untested. You know, one of the only examples we have to date of a skills partnership is the Australia Pacific Technical College, which was set up in the mid-2000s, offering Australian vocational training to students in the Pacific Islands. And this carried us a dual goals of building skills locally and encouraging some graduates to move to Australia. But in practice, some of the employers and participants really rated the training and, you know, emphasized its high quality, but very few graduates ended up moving overseas. You know, graduates reported finding it really hard to navigate Australia's immigration system. And so now they're looking at a 2-track option where they'll have one track tailored to people who stay and then one track tailored to people who end up leaving. So giving them much more support on, you know, navigating immigration systems, you know, giving them the tailored English language skills they'll need, that kind of thing. But I think the one example that we've really got of a skills partnership shows really clear development benefits, but it doesn't achieve its mobility objectives. So in a way, we're sort of talking about a reverse problem facing some of the traditional partnerships that have been good at encouraging mobility, and then sometimes their development benefits have been a bit more mixed. So I think to take a step back and think about what the lessons are for partnerships to encourage skilled migration, I think one lesson is that you really need to have some avenues for longer term migration, especially if you want to engage employers who otherwise just don't want to invest large sums in training participants. You know, often these programs last for a couple of years and then people return home, but if you're really investing in the vocational training and language training for a participant, the incentives just might not be there for a destination and country employer to really spend their money on these programs. And, you know, sometimes there just might not be job opportunities for migrants if they return home. So I think we really need to think about having some access to longer-term migration within these programs. But in doing so, we also need to think about ways to ensure skills transfer and development benefits if people aren't returning home. So whether that's through the skills partnership model where you're training other people who don't leave, or whether that's by encouraging the productive use of remittances and building diaspora networks of those who do leave. I think another lesson is really thinking about how to encourage mobility. You know, you need to target sectors that are in high demand in destination countries, but that also have a surplus workforce in countries of origin. You know, for the triple win, as Andrea set out, you know, it's all about selecting partners who have high unemployment rates in the nursing sector to try and avoid this brain drain issue. And skills partnerships, so they're training new workers, do need to still pick in-demand sectors. And this is arguably much harder to do because you're talking about making really long-term investments in education and training with a much, you know, longer lead-in. So if priorities change in one country, you're a bit stuck because it can be really expensive and time-consuming to keep updating course provisions. It's also really important to keep coordinating. You know, you need to coordinate within government. Development actors who invest in these partnerships need to work with migration actors who set the selection policies and employment agencies to understand demand, especially as we see labour markets undergo these big shifts over the next few years. And it's also very important to coordinate with employers and industry. This is both understanding demand, but also connecting people with job opportunities if the main point of entry is going to be through employer-sponsored visas. And then I think the final lesson is really thinking about how you share costs equitably. You know, the few evaluations that are available suggest that some of these programs can end up costing tens of thousands of dollars per participant once you start factoring in the cost of training, visas, travel arrangements, accommodation, and wages. And the one example we've got of a skills partnership, the APTC, in practice wasn't that much cheaper because they had to fly in specialist trainers from Australia to train people. And so they, you know, in sum, it would have been about the same price to fly people out to Australia instead. So they really need to figure out how they can keep costs down while still providing the high quality training that people need to succeed. And also thinking about how you can share out these costs. You know, if the costs are really high, it's hard to shift these costs to employers, especially if people can't stay for that long. So I think sort of in sum, you need to think about what really constitutes value for money. You know, is this a development initiative where the costs will be covered by development agencies? Or are you looking for a model where you can eventually shift this over to non-government actors like employers? And this really affects, you know, what is competitive, what is this calculus of value for money, and how do you weigh this up against other very important considerations like, you know, really building skills in partner countries?
Kate, that was a brilliant overview. Thank you so much. And you touched upon this all-important question of evaluation that Andrea mentioned, which we need much more of to glean some of the rich lessons that you've outlined here for us today, including that, you know, if these programs, while they can have benefits in you know, enriching the pool of skills to individual workers, if they're not intimately attuned with immigration policy changes in countries of destination, you can actually hinder the migration objective. And so we need more opportunities to mine programs for, you know, design challenges like this. We're going to shift into our question and answer portion. I invite everybody to use the Q&A function on your screen or email events@migrationpolicy.org. We have a couple of questions so far, and I want to start by asking both Kate and Andrea to address a question that came in about the private sector. How can countries better engage the private sector and ensure buy-in from employers? Andrea, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so, well, what you have to keep in mind, of course, when trying to engage with the private sector is that not all of the employers have been in touch with immigrant workforce. So there's also a kind of intercultural training you would probably have to provide for those employers who've never worked with migrant workers and who don't really know what this means for them and for their own work. So in sometimes what we see also in the Triple Win program, that, like I said, it requires a lot of communication, a lot of trying to figure out what the employers think, what kind of labor they will get, what kind of effort it requires from their side, and also to think about their long-term requirements. Most employers are not interested in having workers who will leave again soon, because it's an investment also in trying to train people and trying to get them to know all the procedures and so on and so forth. So temporary programs might not be in the best interest of many employers.
Yeah, I completely agree with Andrea. I think one of the guiding principles really is simplicity. You know, I think that making sure that employers who might not be that familiar with recruiting foreign workers understand how this program works, that you've set really clear expectations both on the side of the migrant and the employer, and that you make it easy for them to participate. So being upfront about the costs that they'll need to spend on training workers, you know, being upfront about what access they'll have to keep the workers if they like them after the end of the program, that kind of thing. I think in terms of getting employers involved at an early stage, one really interesting example that perhaps Andrea can speak about in a little bit more detail. So Germany had a program with Tunisia a few years ago to offer recent graduates, you know, training in engineering in Germany. And I think one of the interesting takeaways from that was that at the end of the program, many of the graduates ended up working for German companies. And some of those were in Germany, but some of them were also in Tunisia. So perhaps one lesson from that is that as you're trying to get employers you know, involved in some of these partnerships where people will go for temporary training or work, you know, maybe it's worth thinking about where the private sector wants to expand their operations and, you know, selling participation in some of these programs as a way to build your workforce and help them navigate some of the challenges of expansion and recruiting from a local workforce, and so bridging some of the, you know, professional and cultural gaps that you can sometimes have between, you know, one company from a different country and the local labor force. So that's just one idea of some of the ways in which you can involve the private sector and make sure that you're sort of prioritizing their needs while also thinking about this development component and keeping that as a top priority.
Yeah, if I could just come in on this question too, I think there's one of the ways of increasing the usefulness and the duration of these programs is really to, in some cases at least, to let the employers take the lead and make known their labor market gaps and so on. And some employers do this even sort of without government intervention and outside of the bilateral framework. I'm thinking in particular of the case of the Porsche company, manufacturer of luxury motor cars. And they had found that they were selling some cars in the Philippines, and they had a network of technicians who were specially trained to work on Porsche cars, which are very delicate and demanding of service technicians. But their Filipino technicians were being recruited to the Middle East, where Porsche was selling a lot more luxury motor cars. But they found that they were unable to service some of their cars in Southeast Asia because they were losing all these technicians. So they set up a program in the Philippines to train people to work on Porsche cars, and some of them elected to work on Porsches in the Philippines, but many of them emigrated to the Middle East for periods of time. And it was a way that the private company was able to meet its needs, to prevent a hollowing out of its service systems in one region while also building it up in another. But that and that, I think, you know, has worked well. That's another example of triple win, but one initiated by the private sector. As both Kate and Andrea made clear, it's important that immigration laws and regulations sort of align themselves with labor market needs, and also important in these structures that there are safeguards for the rights of workers, because we have seen, considerable abuses, particularly, as Andrea pointed out, in sectors where the workforce is predominantly made up of women migrants.
So the guiding principles appear to be simplicity, clear expectations, and introducing incentives based on businesses' bottom lines, among others. We have a specific question here for you, Andrea. One of our participants wants to know if you can elaborate more on the program you mentioned between Mauritius and Canada to entice low-skilled migrants.
I'd rather point that question towards Kathleen, if I may, because I'm not that familiar with that program. I just thought this was a very interesting example of a case where there have been no prior linguistic and historic and colonial ties, but it was a decision of having that partnership. So I don't know, Kathleen, if you can elaborate a bit on that.
Sure. It was a rather unusual program, as Andrea points out, but Canada did open up a program which was really called for by its provinces. Some of the Western Canadian provinces were having difficulty identifying and attracting migrant workers, and so the federal government assisted them to set up a program that would bring workers from Mauritius to work primarily in the food service, the food preparation sector. I think it was a company called Maple Leaf, although my recollection may be faulty on that. And it was small, but it had the effect of acquainting workers in Alberta, employers in Alberta and Saskatchewan with the skilled labor force, the semi-skilled labor force that exists in Mauritius, and making it possible for them to emigrate. It also was a way for the Canadian government to recognize its approval of Mauritius's economic and migration policies, a sort of reward for good behavior in multilateral dealings, because Mauritius is quite isolated out in the Indian Ocean and didn't have many natural ties encouraging labor migration.
Thank you, Kathleen. I have a question here for Kate. As part of the Global Skills Partnerships, what about family members? Are there any considerations for ensuring family unity or at least maintaining family contact?
So I think that's an ongoing issue for many of these programs that offer temporary status. A lot of these programs really recruit people on a temporary basis for work, and potentially there's access to permanent residence if you qualify for an employer-sponsored visa or if pass a licensing exam. But there are a number of steps to that, and many of these temporary work visas have limited access to family unification. So I think that's a key consideration, and it kind of comes back to that expectation setting. Are we thinking about promoting mobility on a temporary basis, or are we looking for longer-term recruitment? And if so, if you're looking for longer-term recruitment, then family reunification is an important part of the calculus for immigrants deciding if they want to move to one country or to another. So I think that if you are looking at a model where you're really thinking about recruiting people on a longer-term basis, for these jobs that need filling in destination countries, you really do need to start thinking about some of the sort of lifestyle components, and family reunification is going to be one of them. Can you bring your family with you? How arduous is that? How long do you have to wait? And can you sort of relocate your life in a feasible way? So I think that goes for skills partnerships, but that's also a broader issue with some of these temporary worker programs that really are sort of a two-step process to becoming a longer-term worker.
I think, as Kate pointed out, that access to family reunification and longer-term status is a real comparative advantage for countries that are prepared to offer it to migrant countries, to migrant workers in this sort of global competition for skills. I recall talking with a Filipino nurse who had worked in Japan for many years, but had moved to the United States. And I asked her why, and she said, well, I took a pay cut to move from Japan to the U.S., but here I have a prospect. Here I have a future, and I can bring my children, and they will have a future. But she didn't feel that she would have those opportunities in Japan. And I think that illustrates some of the ways that countries really can put themselves in a position to recruit the best and the brightest, and indeed to recruit needed low-wage workers by offering them a future.
To continue on this topic, we have a question here that asks us to consider how bilateral and multilateral agreements can put in place provisions that benefit migrants. We've talked a lot about benefits to countries of destination and employers, but just to continue in this vein, Andrea, do you want to comment on how to infuse these agreements with things that are migrant-centered?
Yes, of course. I mean, most people want to migrate for the sake of work. So they are looking for better employment opportunities. They are looking better for higher income. They are looking for opportunities to enhance their skills. So everything that is providing an improvement on these three questions would be in the interest of migrants, I assume. And then once the scheme has been designed, it's of course very important to make sure it's taking place in a regular way, and that migrants' rights are being respected. And what you sometimes see is that there is a multitude of recruitment agencies who ask high fees from the migrants, depending on the expected income increase. That this can lead to very, very harmful practices for the migrants, and these types of recruitment, of course, should be avoided. And that means often it means government regulation. It means also regular inspection of the processes at work. Yeah, these are some of the issues that come to my mind.
Thank you very much for that overview. To switch topics a bit, I have a question here about Brexit. One of our participants asks if Kate can comment on the implications of Brexit for migration into the United Kingdom at all skill levels.
a change of tune.
We're just picking on you because of your accent here.
What gave it away? Well, I think that in terms of how Brexit will affect migration into the UK, you know, by being outside of the EU, and with the caveat that we still don't really know what the post-Brexit immigration system will look like in the UK, and what the relationship between the UK and the EU will be in terms of, you know, movement of workers and, you know, how many EU workers can come and settle in the UK and under what conditions. But I think that, you know, Brexit presents an opportunity for the UK to, you know, rethink some of its immigration programs and think about how it attracts workers at all skills levels. I think especially at the lower skilled levels, the UK has really sort of relied on EU nationals to fill a lot of jobs, you know, especially in its agriculture sectors, in its tourism sectors, that kind of thing. And if there is a scenario where, you know, movement from the EU to the UK is much lower and much more regulated, then the UK needs to start thinking about how it can, you know, attract the migrant workers it needs in all skills levels to move to the UK. And so that might be an opportunity to really sort of look outside the EU for some of these demands and explore whether, you know, a migration partnership along this line might be a good way to start building relationships with some of the countries that are keen to send their workers to the UK, and seeing if you can sort of regulate migration and encourage temporary migration in a way that can be really beneficial to some of the countries of origin that the UK could partner with.
Yes, and I think it is an opportunity. Every cloud has a silver lining here, of developing some country-specific incentives and benefits of this kind of migration, both for the migrants and for the countries of origin. Obviously, one thing that countries of origin think about and benefit from immediately is the remittances of migrant workers, which is a major factor not only for the households that receive them, but for the national accounts of the countries that receive them. But beyond that, thinking about some of the ties that can really promote the benefits of having nationals work in a developed country, twinning institutions, for example. If you not only have Ghanaian, for example, nurses working in the UK, but have ties established between UK and Ghanaian hospitals so that health workers in both countries can enjoy greater mobility, perhaps, and also make use of the skills that people acquire in the UK. I think, making it, countries of origin can think about ways of trying to make it easier for returning migrants to have their credentials acquired abroad recognized at home. And the destination countries can think about, and the employers there can think about how to make sure that the skills acquired by migrants by working in, say, the UK are actually useful when the migrants return home, because that's a bit of a problem too. If on the one hand, if you have a nurse who goes back to the Philippines having worked in Norway, speaking Norwegian, how useful is that really going to be to her when she gets back home? But a counterexample, I encountered a returned migrant in Mexico who had worked in the Napa Valley in the wine industry for many years, and he had learned about drip irrigation, which is much more environmentally sound, uses less water, is better for the plants, and who had piece by piece imported the equipment for drip irrigation that he'd learned in the Napa Valley back to his farm in Mexico. So, distinguishing between what skills are really going to be useful in these partnerships to both countries is something that would bear more thinking.
It's clear that countries have a lot of work to do if they're going to seize some of the opportunities that are available in this moment. So along those lines, Kathleen, one final question for you. National leaders are gathering in New York at the end of September for the first time since the final text of the Global Compact was agreed. Can you give us a sense of what we can expect, both in New York and over the next couple of months, in terms of the adoption and implementation of the Compact?
Well, thanks for that question, Natalia. The Global Compact is due to be adopted in December at a big conference in Marrakesh, but the General Assembly session in September will be an opportunity for countries to assess, the progress made. The negotiations are officially closed. So really now we're entering what some have called the era of implementation, and the co-chairs of the Global Compact process have pointed out that the implementation phase began like the next minute after the negotiations were closed. So that will really, I think, be the focus of discussions in New York in September. Is, now we have an agreed text on the Global Compact. What does it mean? How can we put flesh on those bones and ensure that the Global Compact does make a real difference on the ground for migrants and for the countries that send or receive them.
Thank you for that. I think that is an appropriate note to end on, as we are just about out of time here. So I want to thank our panelists for this very rich discussion and all of the insights that they have contributed today. I urge you all to look at the wonderful papers that have been produced for our series in cooperation with GIZ on Toward a Global Compact for Migration, where you will find much more information than we had time to go into today on all of these topics. And a big thank you to the German Ministry for Development Cooperation for their generous support on this project. As mentioned, we released a new paper for this series today, written by Kate Hooper, and you can also find the paper referenced by Andrea and Kathleen on legal migration pathways for low-skilled workers, also as part of this series.
Natalia, I wonder if I could just add one word before we close, which is to point out that Andrea Riester is moving on to another position after this week. She has been a marvelous partner in GIZ's sector project on migration and development. We will miss her, and we wish her tremendous luck and further accomplishments, which are her forte in her next position. Thanks, Andrea, and Godspeed.
Thank you very much.
Kathleen, for that. Thanks. That's very kind of you, and it was a great pleasure working with you.
And as a final reminder, you can access audio from today's webinar at our website, migrationpolicy.org/events. And if there are any reporters on this call who need more information, please contact Michelle Middlestadt at 202-266-1910. Thank you all.